Okay, let me repeat. We're on Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis in Bava Metzia in Parak Hamafkid. And last week we kind of repeated, but anchored our discussion in the question, the machlokes really between Abaye and Rava, as to whether or not a tchila b'pshia v'sofer ba'ones, if a particular event starts with pshia, with some carelessness, but then sort of the carelessness becomes secondary, and the end result is an ones, whether a shomer chinam, for instance, or even a shoel who is potter from ones, whether or not, and chayiv for pshia, whether or not you're chayiv or potter, because remember, you started with what was carelessness, but the carelessness had nothing to do with the end result. The end result was an ones. So there's a serious machlokes between Abaye and Rava. In the name of Rabbah, Abaye says in the name of Rabbah, no, you're always chayiv because you start with pshia. Pshia is the overwhelming sort of event. And Rabbah says no, that pshia, it could be pshia, but at the end of the day, if it's ones, then you're not really responsible. So if you recollect, we staked out the positions of both Abaye and Rava. Each one gave their position, and each one said, sort of euphemistically, my position is the only position. If you don't take mine, then you're not a worthy judge. Okay, that's a little overstatement, but it shows the vehemence and the strength by which each one believes in its opinion. Now, we'll pick up from there, but first, when the Gemara says that, and we'll get right to the line, that Abaye, for instance, says that, let me find the right line. Okay, so Abaye says, and this is about, I don't know, 10, 15 lines from the top. Kol dana de lo don ki haydaina lav daina, who's not a judge, lo maboya lemandam et chilasa b'pshia v'sofer bonus chayiv. The chayiv, there's no question that according to the Shita, that chilasa b'pshia v'sofer bonus is chayiv, that you're chayiv, he wants to be mechadish that afilu lemanda omer potter, even if to the other side, meaning Rava's side, that you're potter, hocha chayiv, in our case you're chayiv, by tama dominan, a hevla the agma kotla. You remember that Abaye took the position that in our case, the air of the swamp, because remember that there was a case where the animal went to the swamp. So we're saying that the air of the swamp is what really killed the animal. So even though it was an onus, it was an accident at the end, but the pshia, the carelessness of allowing the animal out of the barn, is what kicked off the series of events which brought the animal to the agam, to the swamp. And even though later the animal died what we would call a natural death because it left the swamp, it left the swamp, but the swamp didn't leave it. So in other words, so to speak, that the swamp remained with the animal and was the reason for the death of the animal. So now, that was the Gemara, and we went further. What we didn't really get into, and I want to start with that, is the Rashi. Rashi says, Loma boya lemanda omar, this is about maybe 8 or 10 lines into the narrower lines from the top. Rashi says as follows, Loma boya lemanda omar. In other words, no question according to the Manda Omer that says you're chayiv, you're chayiv. But even according to the Manda Omer that says you're potter, here you're chayiv because of the agam. So what's the case? What is the case where he says you're chayiv? In which case are you chayiv? So just so happens, Rashi says, Lo mavoya, that the case is cited in our Gemara later on, and we're going to come to it in a few weeks. The case is on Mem Beis Amid Aleph, if you want to flip over. It's an interesting case over there because that's the case that he says for sure you're chayiv. What is the case? Okay, so you had what we call a blind. You know, when you're going to shoot a bird, then you go into a blind, and it's a small little constricted area, and from there you are able to, quietly wait. And when the bird is up in the air, then you shoot the bird. So that's what that Gemara is. So it's near the bottom of the daf. Ahu gavra daf gezusu gabe chavre usvina betzrifa de orvin. So Ruvain gave Shimon $100 and said, "Do me a favor. I need you to hold this $100 for me. I'm traveling, or I can't keep it in my pocket. I need for you to hold that $100 for me." They said, "Sure, no problem." And what did he do? He hid it in the blind. Now, what's the point of that? So Rashi there says that Tzrifat Urvani is bias cotton ogle. It's a small round area, kimin kova, like a hat. He described it. That's where you hide to shoot the birds. The Urvani, Shalaravahi, it's made of aravas, meaning it's made out of the branches of an arava. So he says that in that particular case, Omar Rabbi Yosef, says the Gemara there, Afal Gabdel in Gabe Terusehi in the Terusehi, the Gabe Ganve, Linian Ganve in the Terusehi, it's safe because nobody looks in a blind for money. Nobody looks in the money. The Indian Nura Shiasa. If a fire were to start and you had hidden the money in that blind, then that would have been carelessness. Why? Because it's ripe for a fire, and if the money is hidden in that blind, it'll definitely be burnt up. So what do you have over there? Gemara's example: have a tchilaso b'pshia, v'sofa ba'ones. You have a tchilaso b'pshia. What's the pshia? So Rashi had said that the best form of safety for a hiding money is in the ground. If you hide it in the ground, then nothing can ever happen to it. He didn't hide it in the ground. He hid it in this blind, and it turned out that it was stolen. But wait a minute, theft is not a risk in a blind. We're saying that it is that no one goes into a blind to steal. Nevertheless, there the Gemara says, since there was a pshia, there was carelessness, not for theft, but for fire. There was no fire. There was a theft. Nevertheless, says the Gemara, even though he hid it and it was safe from ganavim, but not safe from fire, if it turned out to be stolen, he says it's chayiv. So the sofa ba'ones. Chilasa was pshia because he shouldn't have hid it there because of fire, but sofa ba'ones because it was stolen, and theft is not a risk. Says the Gemara, chayiv. So that's the case that our Gemara brings down. When our Gemara says, lo maboya l'man Omar, there's no question according to the one the Omar who says that you're chayiv. This is what he's referring to. He's referring to this case where the Gemara says that you're chayiv even though the result was not what you expected, because the pshia had nothing to do with the end result. The pshia was fire. The end result was theft. There is no risk for theft, but you're chayiv. So when the Gemara says, in our Gemara, which we said last week, and we're repeating, that Abaya says that for sure, according to the Manda Omar who says chayiv, he's referring to this Gemara. This Gemara is the Manda Omar who says that if you start with a pshia and end with an ones, then you're chayiv. So he says, no question, according to that Manda Omar, you're chayiv. But even according to the Manda Omar who says tilasa b'pshia, the sofa ba'ones is potter, our Gemara here, the one we're quoting, is chayiv. Why? Because of havla de agma kotla. So in other words, Abaya is covering his bases by saying the Gemara that tells us that you're chayiv because you were careless at the beginning by not burying it in the ground. That's what you should have done. Now, even though it was safe from theft, it wasn't safe from fire, and we see that the end result was that there was a theft, then you're chayiv. So again, Abaya goes to the extreme because Abaya says, Chilas of the Pshia. If the Pshia was the first event, even though the Pshia had nothing to do with the end of the event, you're chayiv. So, but even in our case, if you would say tchilas b'shia like Rava, that you're potter, nevertheless you're chayiv, says Abaya, havla the agma kotla, because of the ear of the agam made him ill, made the animal ill, and he died. So that's pshat Abaya. I just wanted to clarify that's what Abaya means, because you have to look at that Gemara later on. You have to understand that he says chayiv. Now, Rava, on the other hand, who says potter, Rava says that Mishmei de Rabba potter, and he also says that you have to hold like me, otherwise you're not dying. What does he say? Lamanda potter. According to the one who says Tchilas is potter, the potter, of course you're potter. But even according to the Manda Amar, that you're chayiv, that Tchilas b'pshia, the sofa ba'onis is chayiv, which would be Abaya, he says, hacha. So, in other words, to him, there's no question that in that Gemara that we quoted in Mem Beis Amid Aleph, that you're potter. There's no question you're potter, because one has nothing to do with the other. You started with a pshia on fire, you ended with a ones on Geneva, and for Geneva there was never a havamina that you would that it was the wrong thing to do. So you can't find him liable because he didn't do anything wrong. There was no tchilas of pshia for Geneva. But even according to him, according to the Mandamar, who would say that you are chayiv, so says the Gemara, Hakha Potter, my Tama, and this is how we ended last week. The Amrita Malacham Maves, Mali Hacha, Mali Hasa. In other words, what our answer was, what difference is it to the Malacham Maves where he finds his victim? So if you believe that it's the Malacham Maves ultimately that was the reason the animal died, so according to Rava, it doesn't matter. Because that onus at the end would have occurred anyway, because the Malach HaMaves would have gotten them either in the Agam or in the house. So Rava takes the lenient view and says, no question over there in the Gemara Membeis, you're potter. But even if you were to say that you're chayiv, here there's no question that you're potter because of the Malach HaMaves, and the Malach HaMaves is the one who controls. So we have no control over the matter. So to say that, well, it started with Pshia, therefore you should be chayiv, Rava says, no, that I don't hold of. So that's the machloikis between Abaya and Rava. And now we're going to pick up from that, and we're going to see where Abaya and Rava maybe can find a meeting point, where there's some equilibrium to their position, because right now each one takes a very strident position for their own cause. According to Abaya, chayiv, and according to Rava, potter. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
This introduction of the Malach HaMaves, it seems very rare in the Gemara to ever have that kind of an introduction. So, do we really use the Malach HaMaves for halachic, positioning here, which is the case?
Understood, but I think underlying that, what Rava is really saying is that the death here is random, and therefore, if it's random, you can't hang your hat and say, "Oh, he did something wrong because he started with a pshia, because at the end there was an onus." So how do you balance a pshia at the beginning and an onus at the end? That's a very difficult thing to balance, because neither you nor I nor anyone can sit here and say with definitive result, oh, this is the reason why it died. It died because of the pshia. Because you can say, wait a minute, there was a pshia way back then, but now there's an ones. And if there's an ones, that pshia is in the rear of your mirror. Its history has nothing to do with our event. So that's why.
Since we can't resolve whether the air down by the lake killed him or not.
Yeah, but Rava doesn't even go there. Rava doesn't even go there and say that the air had anything to do with it. He's saying that it's a random event, because anything, unless you're an investigator and you come up definitively and you say, oh, wait a minute, we see the cause of death such and so, because you know how they do it. I mean, yes, we see particles of the agam in his lung and this, that, and the other. There's none of that. There's no forensic evidence. There's nothing. There's only Baal Peh. Okay, yeah, there was an ones. yeah, there was a pshia. So how do we balance it? Comes Rava and says, in that particular case, we have to go Lakula. We have to be Mako. And we have to be Mako, and we have to say that it was not the pshia. Now, why? Now we have to give a reason why it wasn't the pshia. That's why this Malach HaMavis story comes up, because we're trying to hang our hat on something to tell us why there was a pshia. We have to fill in the blank and say there was no pshia. It was an ones. Why wasn't it an ones? Answer is because the pshia happened in the past. The animal then died, and we somehow don't have enough information to link it to the pshia. So we have to come up with a reason. So he comes up with a reason, and it says it was a natural death. It could have been anywhere. You're right that this is not an oft-used teretz that Rava is giving about Malach HaMavis, but nevertheless, this is his Claire. He comes up and says, if something is random and you can't figure it out, then you have to sort of put two and two together and says, you know what, this is just an event. It happened. And it was the Rabbeinu Shalom, i.e. the Malach HaMavis, who was in control here. And therefore, and again, remember, Rava is Lishitaso, that he's Makel. If he's Makel, he's got to find a reason to be Makel. And his reasoning is because of the Malach HaMavis.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
It's at the risk of slowing down the shiur, but there was a case that I read about which seems to fall squarely in here, and we never understood it. I just wonder if I could just kind of see if it's the same type of case.
Yeah.
There's this publication called the Business Weekly that they put out in Shul every Friday. So the case they had was 3 boys go to the gym, and one boy is very careless about not locking his locker, and he puts his wallet in there and his keys and everything. And so the other 2 boys, wanting to teach him a lesson, basically to be more careful with his stuff, they decide to take his wallet home. One of the boys takes his wallet home with him. He says, I want to teach him a lesson so he'll know better. Not to steal the wallet, but he says, I'm just going to take it. And then when he realizes he lost his wallet, I'll give it back to him. So the friend takes it home that night, and unfortunately there's a fire in the house and the wallet is destroyed. Okay. Yeah. So, and it goes through, they call it Rabbi Dayan, they go through the whole explanation, and eventually their conclusion is that even though the boy should not have taken the wallet in the first place, he's not responsible for the loss, the damage to the wallet and the loss, because, even though he was negligent in taking the wallet, he was not, and I forget which type of shomer, but he was not a shomer that was responsible for a fire, which was a totally unanticipated fire. It sounds like that's kind of this case here. It began with pshia, and it ended in onus, and it sounds like the holding there is like they hold. In other words, there's no connection. I just always assumed if you do an inappropriate act and then something bad happens eventually, you started it, you're responsible for it. But it sounds like Rava is saying you do something inappropriate, something negligent, and then something completely out of your control happens and the wallet gets burned or the animal dies. We don't connect the two actions. We like kind of stop in the middle. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yeah, right. So your point is correct in that Rava says where you start with a pshia, because there was a pshia here. As long as that pshia is still alive, so to speak, in other words, the pshia continues, then you can hang your hat and say it's the pshia that is the cause of the event, and therefore you're chayav. But once there's an intervening event, and a clear intervening event, which says the pshia has ended, we're now, okay, it shouldn't have happened, it wasn't the right thing, but it doesn't dominate the discussion. So now the pshia is over, and now we're in a different category of where it's totally out of his control. So this is the essence of the machlokes between Abaye and Rava, where Rava says we can demarcate and say the pshia ended, and therefore he has no chiyuv. Abaye says, no, wait a minute. It never would have happened to the ones if the pshia hadn't kicked off the series of events. So you're right in that respect. I don't want to get into that particular case.
Right.
But you're right.
It just triggered in my head because it always bothered us that once you take a bad action, it would seem that you should be responsible for everything that happens beyond that, even if something eventually happens out of your control.
Right.
But what Rava is saying is no. If there's an intervening event, there's you're not responsible for what ultimately happened with the animal, etc. then
Right. But remember, Yale, the reason for that is because each each person in every case has a category, if you will, that he falls into, whether it's a Shem Mechinam, Shem Sacha. In other words, he is, besides who he is a category. And that category defines whether or not he's Chaya for Pshia, for Geneva, for Ones.
got it.
So, for instance, a person who has no vested interest but is a guardian, in which case, the case you brought out, this fellow who wanted to teach the lesson, he was basically a Shomar Chinam. He wasn't being paid. He wasn't a Shomar Chinam is Chayiv for Pshia, but not for Geneva Aveda or for other things. So, in the case, in that particular case, if all there was just the Pshia, and he innocently took it because he wanted to teach him a lesson, but he's chayiv for pshia, then he would be chayiv. Now, if there's an intervening event that sort of ends the pshia, and then now you could say he's no longer a pshia, he is in a different category, then that person, even though he started as a pshia, is no longer a pshia.
Thank you.
So Rava says, I can demarcate. Abaya says, wait a minute, if you hadn't taken it, even though later on it wasn't your fault, but you hadn't taken it, nothing would have happened.
Right. And therefore, no matter what happens afterwards, you're responsible because you started off.
You're responsible, right. Which is why in the case that he brings down of the blind, in other words, you should have, if someone gives you money to hold, you know what? You should bury it in the ground. That should be number one concern because that's safe. You don't do that now, wait a minute. Did you open yourself up to Geneva? Not really, because there's no, Genevas don't usually happen on the blind, but you did open yourself up to carelessness because of a fire. So even though the fire wasn't the end result of what happened in the case, there is pshia because you didn't do the highest and best form of shmira. That's what the Gemara is saying. So in other words, it is a little bit, I mean, we have to apply our thinking here. And like Jay asked, all of a sudden, Rabbi gives the teretz of Malach HaMavis. Yes, these are all terutzim to justify a position. But the underlying point is that we see how difficult it is to nail down a view, either of a buyer or of a Rava, of who would be responsible in the case, in such a case. And so each one is Lishitasa. Abaya says Lishitasi, you're always chayav by Peshea, when you're a Peshea, kicked off something that even though later on it sort of veered into another direction, but you started it. Abaya, and then Rava comes and says, no, you don't look at the beginning, but you look at the end. So this makes the machlekes pretty clear, but also difficult sometimes to get our arms around as to what's the real chiddush here, what's the real reason why Abaya and Rava take their positions.
So Toby, quick question. I'm just curious, is the doctrine of the fruit of the poison tree, is that infinitely expansive, or is this is it applicable here, or parallels? I don't want to waste time, but that just occurred to me very, very quickly.
So that's a very good point, because the fruit of the poison tree is really what Abaya is saying we're dealing with. In other words, that you're tracing it from its beginning. Its beginning was bad, and according to him, there was no intervening way to undo what was done. So that's the fruit of the poison tree. You just connect the dots and you say, at the end of the day, that was the cause. Absolutely correct. That's Abaya Shita. It's Abaya Shita. Rava, on the other hand, doesn't hold from that. He doesn't say that once guilty, always guilty. He said you can be guilty at the start, but you can still sort of avenge the guilt, and you can find a positive way to spin it. So that in fact it's a good way of putting it, but that could be the, from our parlance, the way we talk, that could well be the machlokes between Abaya and Rava. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead. Anybody else?
One question: if somebody lent a car to somebody else, and that other person parks it in front of his house, and along comes some storm and a tree falls on it, right? You have the same question: who's responsible for the damage to the car?
Except that over there, you're going to be hard pressed to argue that the person who parked the car was pshea. Remember, you have to have a pshea, a carelessness at the start to kick off the question and then come back and says yay or no. If you have permission to take the car and park it, and you park it in front of your house, you have done nothing wrong. There's no pshia, there's no carelessness. There's literally, I'm a shayma chinam, because all I did was, you gave me the car, I parked it, I put it. Now something bad happens. Just because something bad happens, you can't attribute it to me, because why? What did I do wrong? If I left the barn door open, that's a pshia. Animal went out, died, etc., etc. But if you're taking just a nominal event that has no, no right, no wrong, no up, no down, it's just an event. We don't say that every event triggers off a problem. In other words, most events do not trigger a problem. It's only when the event can be attributed to something not quite right, as in the case of the barn door, for instance, or the case of the blind. Now, you would argue and say, so what did he do wrong? He hid it in the blind. No one ever steals from a blind, except that when I give you money and I tell you hide the money, the highest and best use is to bury it in the ground, because then nobody can get to it. So there is a trigger because you didn't do the highest and best use. Your example with the car is kind of neutral. You just put the car there. There was no reason. Where should you have put it? You put it in my garage, put it here, put it there. I parked it in front of my house. Again, there's always a way to parse this and to be able to argue to the minutia as to whether or not someone is chayav. But here we see clearly Abaya and Rava are giving us clear picture, each in his own way, as to what is chayav and what is patur. Okay, so let's put that away now. So now we have a clearer understanding of Abaya and Rava. Comes the Gemara and says, Malchamav. Now, says the Gemara about in the middle of the daf, Umoda Abaya. Listen to this. Now, Abaya, who is very stringent and says that you always have to look at the more stringent part of the event, meaning the Pesheya, he admits to Rava, the Hadra Lebe Mora, if you gave the animal back to the owner. So listen to this. The animal escaped. It went to the Agam. It went to the swamp. It then came back, and you captured the animal back, and you gave it back to the owner. Umesa. Now, it's no longer at the Agam, and it died. Says Abaya, the potter. Abaya would agree to Rava the potter, my tama to hadrale, because he returned it. Beleka lememer havla de agma kotla. This is fascinating. Abaya says that if the animal was returned to the original owner and then died in the possession of the original owner, we no longer go back and say that it was the agam, the kotla, the heir of the agam. Now, you and I all know that it could well have been that the animal inhaled very bad air and died later. But Abaya doesn't go there. Abaya says that if the event ended, the animal was returned, it died in the possession of the real owner. So you can't argue that. He says, I retract my position and I say that I don't say Havla da Agma Kotla, and therefore, says Abaya, I admit to Rava that is potter, That's his example. Now, on the flip side, Umoda Rava, and Rava, who is very lenient and says that you always look to the ones, to the end. If the ganef, remember, what are we afraid of in a agam? We're afraid of, Rashi said, we're afraid that the wolves will eat it or it'll be stolen. So here it was stolen. The thief came into the agam and stole it. Umesa kadarka, and then it died a natural death. Be ganef, in the possession of the ganef, the chayiv. In other words, the ganef stole it. And then it died a natural death. Remember, rubber has nothing to do with Avir the Agam. It doesn't talk about the heir of the Agam. So what happened is that the Ganav stole it, which is what we're afraid of, and it died in his possession. So, but it was an ones. So he says, "Kol hechad the ignav Ganav ba'ones umeisa kedarka be'ganav b'chai." My tama the ishavka malacham maves the base of the ganve he kaima. Because according to Rava, who says that the only reason why you're potter is because the Malach HaMavos could have gotten them anywhere. So the answer is, but where was he when the Malach HaMavos got him? He was in the possession of the Ganav. So even though it was an ones, I admit that in the particular case where it's kind of like musical chairs, who gets holding the bag? Who doesn't have a chair? So if you don't have a chair, you're out. In this particular case, you don't have a chair because the Ganav is holding it, even though it's an ones. But the fact of the matter is, it's the Ganav who has it in his possession. You can't get around that. So Rava, who normally takes a very lenient position, comes back and says, since it was the Ganav holding the bag, you are chayiv. So the Gemara gives us an example of where a baya is maida, that onus carries the day. And Rava is moda that Pshia carries the day, even though you could argue and say, but wait a minute, how do you get to the bottom of it? The teretz is that aside from their specific views, Abaya, who says it has to do with Avir the Katla, it wasn't in the Agam. As long as it's not in the Agam, I can't hang my hat on Pshia. And Rava, on the other hand, says it's the Malach HaMavos choice. You could kill him here, could kill him there. But where did he kill him? He killed him in the possession of the Ganav. So a Rava has to admit that since he died in the possession of the Ganav, even though it was the Malach HaMavos who made the choice, it had nothing to do with, let's call it the reality of the event. Nevertheless, because he says it's the Malach HaMavos and the Malach HaMavos got him in the possession of the Ganav, Rava has to admit Chiyuv, just like Abaya has to admit Patur, because it wasn't in the Agam.
So Rabbi,
Yeah.
the animal died in the possession of the Ganav.
Right.
The Ganav is liable for Dalad Vahay.
Say it again.
If the animal died in the possession of the Ganav is the one who's liable for Dalad Vahay. So they're saying there's liability in addition to the liability of the Ganav?
So what you're asking is we turn to the Ganav, and the Ganav should be the one chayiv because it's in his possession, right?
Yeah.
So
I think that's what the Torah says.
no, right. But what you're asking is so it's the Ganav who's chayiv. How do we come back to chiyuv of the person who was careless and let it out in the first place, right? That's the question.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's for purposes of Daled Vehei. You may be right. He may be chayiv or kefil or whatever it is. He may be chayiv, but that doesn't negate the liability of the person who was Pesheya, who created the events that allowed for the Ganav to take it. In other words, our Gemara, you're right. Our Gemara is focused on the person who created the problem. Whether there is Daled Vehei or not, you're right. Maybe there is, and again, but that's not the issue. That won't negate and take away from the liability of the individual. That's the point here. You're right that maybe there's Daled Vehei or Kefil or anything, but Lamaisa, we're still focused on the individual who kicked off the event, and we're asking ourselves a question: does he have liability? Just because the Ganav has liability, do we take liability away from the person who was Pesheya and say that you're off the hook because we found a Ganav? And that's a separate question. And maybe the halacha, maybe you are. I'm not saying no. Maybe the halacha you are off the hook because we have you can't sort of double dip. You got liability on the part of the ganef, and you found the ganef. But the question is whether or not the original guy should have any chiyuv at all for what he did. So in this Gemara, the Gemara is telling us that, that since it's found in the possession of the ganef, therefore tracing it back to the carelessness, we're saying he's chayiv for pshia because we found the ganef, irrespective of whether the ganef is chayiv. So it's a good question, but it's not the focus of what the Gemara is trying to get from this. We don't want to distract ourselves and say, oh, there's a ganef, we found him, therefore there's no liability. Let's focus on the liability of the person who actually created the problem in the first place and allowed the ganef to be who he is. Because if he had locked the barn door, there never would have been a ganef. Okay, so that's a good point. So the Gemara now gives us a back and forth and tells us, okay, this is how Abaya is Maida to Rava, and Rava is Maida to Abaya in a different case. Now we're going to go back to the Gemara that I started with last week when I wanted to read the Gemara on Lamed Vav and Aleph. And what was that? That was the kasha that Rav Ami, that Rav Abba Bar Mamel asked Rav Ami. So what did he ask him? So Chaya Siva, the kasha, Rav Abba Bar Mamel, the Rav Ami. So Rav Abba Bar Mamel asked the kasha. Let's just go back to Daf Lamed Vav and Aleph in the wide lines, and let's see what the kasha was. Eismei Rav Abba Bar Mamel Rav Ami. He asked him a kasha, and he quoted our Mishnah. Someone rented the parah, and then he lent it to someone else. That's our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that the socher is off the hook, and the shoel has to pay the socher, not the original owner, but the socher. Right? So then the Gemara there asked the kasha. What was the kasha? Ve'im Isa. If it's true that the masal is shayma, or one person who gives it to the other, there's liability. Why does the Mishnah say that the sofer is off the hook? Why doesn't the owner say, I never gave permission that my pigadon should be in someone else's hand? So he gave an answer. You know what? This is a different case because the Balaam gave him reshus to give it to somebody else. So there isn't the class of I took it without permission, right? Now, however, but for this case, but for the Rishus HaBalim, and in other words, this answer, this is sort of a left field answer. Oh, the Balaam gave Rishus. Okay. But for that answer, we would say that he is chayiv. He is chayiv to the original owner because he had no permission. Says the Gemara here, let's go back to our Gemara. Says our Gemara here, according to you, who say that the Malach HaMavis is the one, Mali Hacha Mali Hasam, that question which we just repeated, that Rav Abba Bar Mamel asked Rav Ami, and he gave him an answer. What kind of answer is that? Why do you have to sort of pick your right ear with your left hand and say, oh, he gave him permission? Let's get right to the crux of the matter. He doesn't have to answer him and tell him that there was special reshus here. Even if there wasn't special reshus, the Malach HaMavis is the one who intervened. So according to you, Rava, what's the answer to Rav Abba Bar Mamel's kasha? That there was a special event, meaning that the owner gave permission, even without permission. It's the Malach HaMavis, right? It's the Malach HaMavis. So you have no liability because it's the Malach HaMavis who is the one who calls the shots here. So he's asking him a question that why did Rav Ami even have to come to such an answer? when it was plain on its face. If you hold like Rava, this is a kasha of Abaya on Rava. If you hold like Rava, that what? That the Malach HaMaves, then in that kasha of Rabbi Mamamo, there should never have been an answer, oh, that he gave him special permission. Without special permission, it's okay because of the Malach HaMaves. So he wants to slug up and show that Rava, you can't hold like Rava, because since our Mishnah had to come and give an answer, that it's a special permission, that you can't hang your hat on the Malach HaMaves. So that's the kasha of the Gemara. Going back to the previous sugya, if you're going to hold that the Malach HaMaves answer is the determinative answer, why bother giving us? It's kind of like a makeshift answer. Oh, he gave him permission. Even without permission, it should be the Malach HaMaves is the one who's in control. So that's the kasha that Abaye asks on Rava. He wants to slug up Rava's position and say, Rava, your position doesn't hold water because the Mishnah had to come and tell us a teretz of what? Of, oh no, he gave him special permission. That's not special permission is something you have to find sort of, you gotta, as they say, mitlech, you have to find it with a candle. That's not a normal answer. So l'chayra, it seems that Abaye has slugged up Rava based on that. Says the Gemara, no. Says the Gemara, no. So Amalei, so now Rava comes back and he challenges Abaye and he says, Liditchu, according to you, the maslis and aim eternity. Remember, Abaye is the one who said that the reason why you can't do this is because the original owner does not want the pikadon to be in someone else's possession. He only believes in the socher, let's say, and he doesn't want that pikadon to be carried around to someone else. So he says, wait a minute, according to you, that there is a mitzvah shia pikadon b'yad acher, what are you going to say? Ikela osva lahahi, right? So Rav Abba can come back and he can say, wait a minute, that which Rabbi Yochanan says that on every case, when you transfer shomer muscle to shomer, you're chayiv. Why are you chayiv? You're not chayiv because in that particular case, you could say that the owner never wanted it to be in anybody's hands, and therefore that's the reason why you can't be muscle to somebody else. Not for any other reason, but because he trusts the first guy and he doesn't trust anybody else. Remember, there was a shvua involved here, and he basically didn't want anybody else to hold it and to be in his hands. You can ask the question. And but you can't ask the kasha on me about shvua because why? Because I don't hold of it because he made the shvua, and we'll see. Rashi says, he explains this. He actually made the shvua. So if he made the shvua, you can't argue, oh, I don't trust him with the shvua. The socher made the shvua. He said that he wasn't responsible. The owner accepted it, and therefore the socher is not liable, and he can collect from the shoel. It's a little complicated how we're fitting the pieces together, but basically what the Gemara wants to tell us here is that Abaye tries to slug up Rava, and it is not successful, and Rava tries to slug up Abaye, and he's not successful. We wanted to see whether one of them could sort of knock the other one out, and that his shita would be correct. Ultimately, from this Gemara, we're left with what can we say? Abaye's lishitaso, Rava's lishitaso. Abaye does not knock out Rava, and Rava doesn't knock out Abaye. There are cases when Abaye will agree with Rava, or vice versa, but the underlying position is not Abaye's position or Rava's position. So we don't have a definitive answer. So let's take a look at Rashi, because it's a little bit complicated, and Rashi will help us over here. Let's go back up. beganef chayev v'lo amar yihav a beis shomer nami have a misa. We don't say that it would have been the same thing if it was in his house. So that we explained that since he, at the end of the day, it's left in the house of the ganef, so therefore he finds him chayiv, even though Tchilas of Shiur himself of Ma'onis, but it's the ganef who was holding the bag when the music stopped, as we said. Okay, my tama b'shas geneva he avida min abalim. At the time of the geneva, it was lost to the owner. So he's explained to us why is the ganef chayiv, because at the time of the geneva, the Baalim didn't have it. The inami shafka malach hamaves beganef hava. And at the time when the malach hamaves ceased his actions, it was in the possession of the ganef. Hilka chachiyav ba'alo al shasa geneva. In other words, how do you determine where the chiyuv is? The answer is, as I said, when the music stops, take a snapshot. If it's in the hands of the ganef, even though but the ganef is the one holding it, so we have to find him liable. So we answered Rav Abba bar Mamal's kasha by saying that he gave the Baalim Rishus. So Rashi's explained to us, why do you have to give such a narrow answer? Namely, let him say, im iraba ones achadamatzinu, im iraba ones, if there was an onus, achadamatzinu, lemema, im haisa bebesa, lo nansa. So if there was an ones, and we can say that what? That if it was in his house, there never would have been an onus, yachayev. Aval zem misa kedarka malachamavis nami bebeisaycha katallah. But the malachamavis killed him in the house of the socher. And since we didn't answer this, and we answered what? And we said that it was a reshus of the Baalim, so we have to come to the conclusion that the one who says he doesn't distinguish the onus of the malachamavis from any other onus, and he doesn't hold of it. He doesn't hold of the whole principle that Rava introduces of malachamaves, because he's saying if we did, then that could have been the teretz. Why does the Mishnah? Why do we have to? The Mishnah has to say, "Oh no, he gave him special permission." What special permission? The malachamaves is the one who controls it, and here the malachamaves found it in his province that the animal should die in his possession. But since you don't say that, again, it's kind of, we have to deduct from the negative. Since he doesn't say it, therefore we have to return to the positive and say that there was a pshia. So he says, "Liditchu the amar tama the shomer shemasal the shomer chayev." You Abaye who say shomer the masal chayev b'shem ein mitzonei, because the owner doesn't want it in anybody's possession. You can ask the question. The Rav Ami Shonale Elalo Svirale. In other words, he doesn't hold like him. Because I hold that he's not believed because the owner only believes the first guy with the shvua. You can't ask in a kasha shahari socha atzmo nishbalo, because the socha is actually swearing. So if the whole thing has to do with swearing, and we say that the socha swore, and that's the reason why he's potter, then you can't argue on that. You can't say, "Oh, wait a minute, no, I don't want him because I don't trust him." But of course you trusted him. You trusted him and you let him swear. Therefore, it's the shoel who has the responsibility. Again, this becomes a little complicated to fit the pieces together, but which is why I'm saying we're reading the Rashi, but at the end, the teretz is that Abaya and Rava Alishitasam, that Abaya holds that Chilab Pshia V'Sofa Ba'ones, that unless there is a total change of circumstance at the time that the animal dies, the Pshia carries. The Pshia is what's with us the whole time, unless at the end there is no pshia, there's only ones, and there is no contravening sort of factor. Oh, we found the animal in the hand of the ganef. Rava, on the other hand, who says that we always hold potter, so he's saying that the Malach HaMavis is the one who killed him. Okay, fine, but if the Malach HaMavis killed him, and it was but it was still in the hands of the ganef, then you can't argue Malach HaMavis, because we have to look at the reality. The reality is, where is that animal at the time of death? It's in the hands of the ganef. Once it's in the hands of the ganef, then the pshia stands strong, because but for the pshia, it never would have been in the hands of the ganef. So this is the reason why the Gemara goes back and forth, and at the end, we don't find a resolution between Abaye and Rava. We don't find that the halacha is either like Abaye or like Rava, because you can always distinguish one side from the other as to why one is chayiv and one is not. There is as the Gemara said, there is a situation where Abaye admits to Rava and Rava admits to Abaye, but that's when you can whitewash the whole thing and say there is no proof of anything. If the animal died and it was not in the hands of the ganef, then Abaye can never say that you're chayiv, because even if he doesn't hold of the Malach HaMavis answer, it wasn't in the hands of the ganef. It was not. And so there's no way you can manufacture a chiyuv. Rava, on the other hand, says the same thing, even though it's always potter, but if it is in the hands of the ganef, if when the music stops, the ganef is holding it, even though I say tchilah b'pshia v'sofa b'on is potter, still the ganef is the one holding it. I have no choice but to say chayiv, because how can I look away? How can I look away and say there's potter here when the ganef is the one that is holding it? So it's kind of complicated, but at the same time, this machlokes remains a machlokes between Abaye and Rava, and we don't have a definitive answer whether tchilas b'pshia v'sofa b'ones is chayiv or not. It depends on which shita you look at, and the circumstance of the particular case is very important to help us determine whether there's chiyuv and patur. So in one case, in one event, you can have chiyuv if according to Abaye, if the ganef is holding it, but you can have patur if the ganef is not holding it, and for Rava vice versa. You can have chiyuv, you can have patur if it's just the Malach HaMavis, but if it just so happens that when the animal died, it wasn't the Malach HaMavis. Okay, it was the Malach HaMavis, but the ganef is holding it. Then so you have to look at the reality of the end of the case to determine whether there's chiyuv and patur. So that makes it a little bit of a complicated situation, but that's the maskana of the. So, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we can briefly start, or we can just hold and start the next sugya, which again, it goes to the same questions of when an animal died or whatever. So we'll stop here and we'll pick that up next week. So Mitzvah Shem, we'll go weiter. But I don't know if you feel there was a satisfactory conclusion to this Gemara, but it just turns out that the machlokes of Abaye and Rava does not get resolved, and each one is l'shitaso as to whether or not tchilah b'pshia v'sofa b'ones is chayiv. So that goes on.
Okay. Shkoyach.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Rabbi Shkoyach.
Again, a good nechaydish Elul.